This is Deep Down, and I'm your host, Jordan Hunt. I'm a composer, vocalist, multi-instrumentalist, and self-releasing artist. You might also know me as former violinist in the Irrepressibles, as the long-standing musical companion to Grammy-nominated Olivia Chaney, or as a musical and associate director of the Theodem's Company. I delve deep as we explore the creative process and life through the lens of a musician, unravelling universal ideas and enigmas through some of my songs and lyrics, and through some of the profound moments that have shaped me. Join me deep down as we embark on this journey together, in search of answers to the elusive question, what do you really feel deep down? In this episode, I explored joy and suffering, two apparently opposite emotions that one might say define the artist's palette. But far from their obvious differences, are they really just different perspectives of the same thing? Having a musical output largely informed by the latter, I wonder, deep down, do you have to suffer for your art for it to be any good? Welcome, listeners. I know it sounds so ridiculously cliché, but is joy and suffering the musician's lot? Like bitter-sweet, tears of joy acting naturally, or even the living dead, joy and suffering group together well in turn of phrase, and it's got me thinking about their place in my work as an artist and if they're even necessary to being a musician. This past week, my friend Olivia Chaney released her third album, Circus of Desire, which is an absolute triumph. It's so succinct and hard-hitting and tender, and I'm so grateful to be part of it. I play violin and sing backing vocals on a couple of tracks, and unlike her previous records, where we got to record it in person, this one was a little more fragmented, so I was overdubbing lines here and there. So it's amazing to now bring it to life in person with a little band as we prepare to tour it. It's definitely at the joy end of the spectrum, as far as work goes. But at the other end of the spectrum, being back on the road is hard for a highly sensitive person like me. I'm a real homebody, so life on the road is not my ideal place of magic. And the only way to navigate the trials of a lack of home comforts is to overpack and overplan, and try to seek out those moments alone where I might recharge. Not quite suffering exactly, but perhaps a little uncomfortable. So, therein, rather briefly encapsulating this dichotomy of joy and suffering all rolled into one, the joy of making music with Olivia and the discomfort of being away from home in order to actually share it with the world. Of course, I'd much rather it this way round. Sometimes working with a lesser musician than Olivia, the situation on tour may be wonderful with top-tier travel and accommodation, and it has been with Olivia at some points, visiting exciting places, but the music may be terrible. In her case, luckily it's not. I guess the ideal situation would be to find enough money for a brilliant musician like Olivia to have the tour of her dreams in ultimate comfort. At the same time, this month, I've got back into singing lessons with my wonderful teacher, Louise Shepherd. And as I'm juggling a lot at the moment, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. This week I asked her for just one focus as a takeaway for my practice homework. In other words, if I were to focus on the one thing that would make a difference, I think I might actually manage to practice that every day and remember that one thing amidst all the noise and chaos of my life as it stands, switching from job to job and role to role each day. And so my takeaway this week is width. And by that, I think I understand it to mean pharyngeal width, which during my lesson made a great improvement to supporting the very delicate little vocal cords with a strong muscular defense from the collapsing nature of the whole vocal region. And for me to access those muscles, to be able to widen everything around my vocal cords, I have to think about stifling a giggle, and then to add some sweetness and control across my range. I'm trying to find the tilt muscles, which I access through the whimpering effect, as though you're on the verge of tears like a puppy crying. Anyway, this is not a singing lesson, and I'm not a singing teacher by any stretch. But what is so fascinating to me, a sort of neophyte of singing technique is that these muscles are the muscles of joy and suffering, or sadness at least. And in my songs, these muscles make so much sense. It reminds me of the story of when I sang my song Peter at Peter's funeral, and how my voice worked so miraculously, despite sobbing so profusely. And I can only imagine it's because these crying muscles were activated. I talked more about that in my deep dive of my song Peter a few episodes back. And so now, with this idea of width and stifling a giggle, I've been thinking about the sort of full circle idea that they are sort of the same thing, the joy and the suffering, and even the rather extreme muscles that we use to access them. In the way that the sublime is both ecstatic and also dangerous. For example, swimming could be described as sublime because it's such an unnatural, otherworldly phenomenon for a human to experience, floating, suspended in water. It's so different from your everyday walking, sitting, standing on solid ground. To be suspended in water is utterly sublime, but with that sensation comes real danger. And if you're an inexperienced swimmer like me and untrained, it could be fatal. The water, for all her magisterial beauty, can be a very dangerous place to someone like me, who's not a very strong swimmer. So it's like the sublime is constantly riding the cusp of ecstasy and danger. And in the same vein, that's what I seek in the sound of my music, this feeling of the sublime, where we're taken to the edge of emotion and kept there, perhaps uncomfortably long, or perhaps longer than we might normally spend there in our everyday lives before rushing back to safe ground in denial. Last episode I discussed how I found my voice, and thinking back to my meandering train of thought, I realised I didn't talk very practically about how I literally found my voice, other than the fact that I had an opportunity at my first ever gig to showcase what I thought my voice would sound like and how I arrived there. And I mentioned in passing that I had some practice from singing backing vocals with my friend Olivia Chaney, especially in the early days. We would try and refine some beautiful duo parts for us both to sing, and I could learn from someone far more experienced and trained, i.e. Olivia, what the ideal sound of a backing vocalist might be, which suited my personality perfectly. What's funny is that even though I love the sound of my own voice, clearly, with a podcast, and possibly could be accused of having a healthy ego, I don't often think of myself as a frontman. I don't look at the lead singers of bands and think, I wish that were me. Looks like an awful lot of work, to be honest. And I guess that's possibly a psychological hangover from my adolescence and upbringing. And these days, obviously, I don't mind my voice being front and centre on this podcast and in my own music that I make and sing. But that's an aside. It definitely suited me, and does still suit me, to be a backing vocalist with Olivia, and to have that opportunity to be heard on stage and appreciated by an audience without having to be the point, and without having to be responsible for holding the whole show, so to speak. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, Olivia's third album came out this week, and one of the songs, in fact the final song on the record, I Wish, is one I've played with her quite a few times over the past year or two in the run-up to the recording and release. There's a substantial violin part, which is quite rare for Olivia, who often prefers to explore my more ghostly character and sound. The gorgeous melody at the start and close, and a little instrumental interlude before the final verse. I'm not going to play it in this episode, copyright and all that, so please go and check it out if you have a moment, because it's absolutely gorgeous. But the reason I mention it is, as we are now gearing up to take this album on a little UK tour, I've been reacquainting myself with the music and the structures and the lyrics, so that I can turn up to rehearsals prepared. In fact, by the time this podcast is released, we'll probably have played a show in Cambridge already. Hopefully, it will have gone down a treat. So this final song, I Wish, is so perfectly placed as the last song of the album. It's just so devastating and puts the final knife through your heart to finish you off. If you haven't already been bowled over with emotion from the rest of the album. The opening lines are, "I wish my joy and suffering were of some use to you." I can't go into who she's talking to or about, or why she's talking about it, or what it means, etc. It's quite a personal backstory, and perhaps one that I've turned a blind eye to in the past, because otherwise it's a bit too painful to think about. But safe to say it's not about me. And seeing as I've been having singing lessons, which is why I mentioned that earlier, I decided to try and sing this song as a little exercise for me to learn as a cover. I'm not sure what Olivia would think about that, but hopefully she wouldn't mind. So I've sung this opening line many times now, and it keeps sticking out to me. Joy and suffering. It just feels so familiar and so correct somehow. And I was making my afternoon smoothie the other day, and I thought to myself, isn't joy and suffering the sort of job of a musician or an artist? And to become acquainted with these emotions is so important. Perhaps I'm biased because I think I make exceptionally emotive music. Obviously not all music and art are about joy or suffering separately or at the same time, but I guess I'm drawn to art that is, hopefully, somewhere on that spectrum. I picture the spectrum of emotions on a line from 0 to 10, 0 being the absolute depths of depression and doldrums, and 10 being a manic joy out of my control, almost too much. It reminds me of my therapist from a few years back, who would ask me, "Where is your mood today?" Or "Where's your mood been this week?" And I'd give a number, and he would ask me, "And what number do you think you would like to be at most of the time?" I think I said 7 7 out of 10. And then I corrected myself and thought, actually, maybe 5 out of 10, because it's sort of the centre of the line, centre of flux. I don't want to live in a mania, like 9 out of 10 all the time. And I certainly don't want to hang out in the depression and depths of suffering at 1 out of 10 all of the time. 5 out of 10 is a nice zen, calm place for me to be. And then I started to imagine this line from 0 to 10 as a circle, with perhaps 5 at the top of the clock where it's all calm and safe and well, and 10 and 0 at either end of the line, meeting at the opposite side of this circle, which is mania and depression and chaos and joy and suffering. It's just sort of out of control, the opposite of calm, all this energy. Then, because my mind works this way, I connect this to all of the circles in music theory. For example, the circle of fifths and the progression of fifths and the musical alphabet from A to G and straight on to A again. All of these beautiful universal connections that I try to reassure my music theory pupils that once you've got to the other end of the circle, you realise the rules are not overwhelmingly infinite, but are complete and finite and mathematically beautiful and almost naturally occurring, at least in the way Western tonality has been calibrated. A quick explanation to those who aren't familiar. The circle of fifths is a diagram showing how all 12 major or minor keys relate to each other by the interval of a fifth. And if you keep modulating up or down to the neighbouring key by the interval of a fifth, or 5 notes, away from the previous key, then eventually you end up back at the beginning of the circle where you started. It's very cool if you're a music theory geek like me. So you could modulate from C major to G major to D major to A major and so on, all the way around to F sharp major, and then somehow find your way back by all the flat keys back to C major. And it would sort of make musical sense. So I started to think about other comparative things on a circle rather than an open-ended line, either or. And so when I picture that circle, this yin and yang symbol comes to mind, an idea of balance, how we can't have one without the other. And even this Venn diagram of the Japanese concept of ikigai that I mentioned in an earlier episode, What Was I Made For?, where you have the intersection of what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. And the point at the centre of intersection almost exists in a sphere. There are conceptual circles or spheres all over the place, and so for whatever reason, this line from Olivia's song, Joy and Suffering, stuck out to me. It's also such an exquisitely beautiful and painful line, I wish my joy and suffering were of some use to you, as though these deep emotions may serve some practical purpose. And as a deeply pragmatic person, that really resonates with me. They're almost opposites, emotion and pragmatism. It's a bit like exercise, where if you do no exercise, it can be problematic and it's widely considered unhealthy. And on the other end of the circle is a healthy amount of exercise that provides health benefits. But if you then do too much exercise, it again can become unhealthy from both a physical and mental health perspective if it tips over into disordered exercise. So you come full circle, so to speak, on the line of no exercise to lots of exercise. It can be just as bad. It also brings to mind the creative act, and how, for me, most of the music I've made, or I could say most of the good music I've made, in my opinion, has been created in a state of relative suffering or intense joy and connection. And so, for example, my song, The Sea, this song of two very distinct halves that I did a deep dive of a few episodes back. It's about the life and death of my late Aunt Agnes. And I think the reason it doesn't get stuck in a dirge is because at the same time as acknowledging the pain of losing her, it celebrates her life and incredible spirit, the suffering and the joy. And in my song Peter, which again I also did a deep dive of a few episodes back about my late partner Peter, I mentioned this earlier, it's about the pain of letting go. And as I said, it was originally written as a breakup song before he died, actually, and was sort of a way of convincing myself that because of the pain I'd suffered during the relationship, I was looking forward to a hope of a brighter future beyond, and future joy to look forward to, the cloud's silver lining perhaps, or the happiness that came out of the sadness, all in one emotional document. And what else is a song if not an emotional document? And then on the flip side, I have a rather more optimistic song, Ocean Floor, that will soon be explored in a deep dive episode, about the joy of meeting my partner Chris for the first and second time, and the internal struggle of having dealt or wrestled with my cognitive behavioural therapy before that point, to be able to pluck up the courage to approach him. So all of this joy and suffering and balance with one another to differing extents. I'm obviously drawn to this dichotomy on some sort of deeper level. Of course, not all music needs to be explicitly about joy or suffering or any extreme emotion. I guess I'm personally drawn to that aspect in music in general, hence why I explore it in my own work. If I scan some of my favourite music on my playlist, the music I find is probably at one end of that spectrum, for sure, either or. I really love super, super sad, indulgent, melancholic music, and I also love really, really super upbeat, fast, especially classical music. My violin solo, Two Alone, for solo violin, I just said that, written back in lockdown, is much less explicitly about joy or suffering, with no lyrics, but yet it has this internal labyrinth of notes. It certainly has that kind of emotional narrative at its core, the internal struggle of lockdown in its repetitive pattern, and an eventual catharsis at its climax, which, although it's not explicitly joyful, is certainly energetically extrovert compared to the introverted meanderings of its opening. So there's a sort of a version of joy and suffering there. And speaking of circles and balance and opposites, it brings to mind my own fluctuating nature as a highly sensitive person, an HSP, which I only discovered was a recognised thing a few years ago. For years I wondered about my introvert-extrovert nature, and how I'm not really shy. I've always been quietly confident. I just kept it to myself, especially when I was younger. I've certainly learned to communicate my inner world as I've gotten older, hence this podcast. I think as a performer, there's probably an innate level of extroversion necessary to stand on a stage and bare your soul. But I've always found this paradox interesting of actually being pretty introvert, I think, but in a rather extroverted way, an introverted extroversion or performative intimacy, the opposite, vice versa. I suppose that's what this podcast is to some extent. performed intimacy. Though it doesn't feel at all performed. I'm being very open about my vulnerability in a really confident way that I doubt I could do if I were truly shy. Though, of course, the platform does seem to suit that openness, as it's just me talking into a microphone in my little studio alone. It's often been quite tricky when navigating socializing, etc., and work with other people. Some people assume because I'm sensitive to their needs, bringing energy and trying to match their energy sometimes, they assume that I'm naturally extroverted, but often it's just a pragmatic, direct communication for the sake of clarity and efficiency, getting a point across in the most efficient way to save my energy. If I can be efficient, then I can save my energy, if that makes sense. When actually it can be incredibly draining being around people for long periods, whether it's for work or pleasure. For example, I sometimes teach for up to 6 hours in a stretch, uninterrupted. I'm not sure why I do that to myself. And I have absolutely no idea where I find the energy and focus, but for whatever reason, my highly sensitive person traits keep me buoyed for long enough to give my pupils what they need and full attention before I then have to retreat into my shell to recharge for another few hours. I'm not sure where that fits on the circle of joy and suffering, but it's certainly a circle. It's almost like the more joyful socializing I do with people, the more I internally suffer, aware of my rapidly depleting energy levels and how I'll probably have an energy hangover at some point, even if I'm not actually drinking. I promise I'm not a total misanthrope, though. I really do love people, just in small doses. And I can't speak for anyone else's experience, so I'm not sure if others relate to this sensation, possibly more than I think. But the fact there is so much joy in socializing is probably the reason I keep going back for more, putting myself through the pain, if you could call it pain, as it always feels worth hanging out with my friends. And I do really enjoy teaching and that act of service so much. I get a lot out of it, even if it's depleting on some level. It may also explain why friends don't get in touch so much anymore. Maybe we're all just getting older. Maybe I've been a little too vocal about my sensitivities. Or maybe they just don't like me anymore. Who knows? But do you have to suffer for your art for it to be any good? I'm not so sure about this one. I know of many conceptual artists that make rather anti-emotional work on the surface, but perhaps it still costs them something to make. And just because it's dry or on the more abstract end of the spectrum doesn't mean they haven't intensely enjoyed making it or intensely suffered either. Does that sort of middle ground of easy to make, non-invasive, pseudo-emotional approach to music making mean that it won't be any good? As in the case of Muzak or elevator music. I mean, is Muzak not good implicitly? I mean, who am I to judge? Perhaps with the advent of AI-created music, there actually is nothing to fear, as it would never be able to replicate true joy or suffering. I guess that's a question. I really hope that's the case in my lifetime anyway. I think deep down it's interesting to observe the spectrum of joy and suffering as a musician or an artist, and then also just as a human. Whether or not you're conscious of it in the moment, I feel like it's almost a trend these days for musical artists to wallow in melancholia, like in the good old days of Purcell, when melancholia was all the rage of fashion. And sadcore, or whatever core is trending right now, I feel like I was making sad music a decade or more before these young'uns, that particular zeitgeist moment. And I imagine I always will, because I am obviously quite emotional by nature. And it's an interesting trend to observe either way, and it's producing some fantastic music. Perhaps where some artists can miss the point is in not trying to go full circle to connect the sadness, the performative sadness or suffering, to its innate joy and hope. Hope to me is so crucial in even the faintest glimmer if I am exploring darker emotions. For me at least, I hope to visit those waters again. Not too frequently though, as there's certainly so much creative potential in joy and suffering. Do I not write so much music because I am happy? Interesting thought. I think as I age, the calmer waters of 5 out of 10 Zen are where it's at for me. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the circle of joy and suffering as an idea, and whether you've noticed that yourself in your own life and work. Thanks so much for listening. I think I'll wrap there for today. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review this podcast. And if you like it, share it with your friends or on social media. You can find me on all social platforms by searching at Jordan Hunt Music, and you can listen to my music on all good streaming services. Deep Down uses bits of my music nabbed from my songs Ocean Floor and Peter. Check out the show notes on jordan-hunt.com for exclusive tidbits from this podcast. I'd really love to hear from you via DM or email via my website if any of these experiences resonated with you, and if you have questions, suggestions, or requests for future episodes. Thank you so much for listening.